By the midpoint of the Phaedo, Socrates seems to have established some bold doctrines about the soul. It pre-exists the body. It survives the death of the body. It undergoes a process of reincarnation, taking many different bodies. It carries with it the true basis of knowledge, namely the knowledge of the perfect forms of things. It is in the body as in a kind of prison. The soul is imprisoned by the body, and the task of the philosopher is to free the soul from this prison by making it more and more like divine things. Socrates' final argument last time, which was presented as if it were the decisive one, went something like this. So this is the argument that appears in the margin numbers on pages 78b through 80d, and in our text on pages 179 through 181. Let's summarize this argument. Premise 1. It is characteristic of divine things to be invisible, ruling, uniform, that is, non-composite, and unchanging. So premise 1, it is characteristic of divine things to be invisible, ruling, uniform, and unchanging. Premise 2, by contrast, it is characteristic of mortal things to be visible, ruled, composite, and changing. Premise 2, by contrast, it is characteristic of mortal things to be visible, to be ruled, to be composite, and to be changing. Premise 3, only composite and changing things perish. Non-composite and unchanging things do not perish. Premise 3, only composite and changing things perish. Non-composite and unchanging things do not perish. Premise 4, the soul is like the divine things in being invisible and ruling. Premise 4, the soul is like the divine things in being invisible and ruling. Premise 5, by contrast, the body is like mortal things in being visible and ruled. Premise 5, by contrast, the body is like mortal things in being visible and ruled. Conclusion. Hence, although the body perishes like all mortal things, it is likely that the soul, being like divine things, does not perish. Conclusion. Hence, although the body perishes like all mortal things, it is likely that the soul, being like divine things, does not perish. So the argument once again, it is characteristic of divine things to be invisible, ruling, uniform, and unchanging. By contrast, it is characteristic of mortal things to be visible, ruled, composite, and changing. Only composite and changing things perish. Non-composite and unchanging things do not perish. The soul is like the divine things in being invisible and ruling. By contrast, the body is like mortal things in being visible and ruled. Hence, although the body perishes like all mortal things, it is likely that the soul, being like divine things, does not perish. So that was the big argument at the conclusion last time, roughly at the midpoint of the Phaedo. Socrates' companions, it turns out, as we begin the second half of the Phaedo, harbor reservations about this supposedly decisive argument. Now, the argument is obviously an argument by analogy, by comparing the soul and noting its similarities or its analogies with the divine things. This is one of Plato's favorite types of argument, an argument by analogy. Its potential weakness, though, is that it may be countered by arguments by analogy that suggest the opposite conclusion, that the soul perishes. And each of Socrates' interlocutors, Simmias and Cebes, present such an argument. So first we have Simmias' argument, which we can call the harmony analogy. And this appears at 86A through D, pretty much the left-hand column of page 184. So you can review that there. I'm just going to leap right to my reconstruction of this argument. And it's a simple three-premise argument. Premise one, the harmony of a lyre, right? You know, like a harp, hand harp. The harmony of a lyre is like the divine things, while the lyre itself is like mortal things. Premise one, the harmony of a lyre is like the divine things, while the lyre itself is like mortal things. Premise two, however, the harmony perishes when the strings of the lyre are broken. Premise two, however, the harmony perishes when the strings of the lyre are broken. Premise three, the soul is a kind of harmony of the body, analogous to the harmony of a lyre. The soul is a kind of harmony of the body, analogous to the harmony of a lyre. And this was a common Greek belief. You can see evidence of this, for example, in Echecrates' comment is on page 185 in the right hand, where he says, I often thought of this, the soul in this way. And also Simmias' statement, 92D on page 187, where he alludes to the fact that this is the way that many men think of the soul as a kind of harmony of the body that's analogous to the harmony of the lyre. And this, of course, leads to the unfortunate conclusion, unfortunate for Socrates' attempt to establish the imperishability of the soul, the conclusion that it's likely that the soul perishes when the body dies, in much the same way as the harmony perishes when the strings of the lyre are broken. So the argument again, the harmony of the lyre is like divine things, while the lyre itself is like mortal things. However, the harmony perishes when the strings of the lyre are broken. The soul is a kind of harmony of the body, analogous to the harmony of a lyre. Conclusion, it's likely that the soul perishes when the body dies. So it's not enough for the soul to be analogous to divine things, because the harmony of the lyre is also analogous to divine things in its invisibility, for example, and of course the divine beauty that the harmony of the lyre has been sometimes described as having. But that's not enough. The harmony perishes when the strings are broken. So maybe it's not enough in the case of the soul either. Maybe its divinity in its invisibility and ruling character when it rules over the body isn't enough to ensure that it continues to exist after the death of the body. Because after all, it's not enough in the case of the lyre. The beauty and divinity and invisibility of the lyre isn't enough to, harmony rather of the lyre isn't enough to ensure that it continues to exist. And so the soul might be like a kind of harmony of the body. In fact, this is what many Greeks believe anyway. So perhaps it perishes too, just like the harmony of the lyre perishes. And so that's the basic idea. Then there's Seebe's argument. And this one we might call the Cloak Analogy. And this goes this way. This is on 87A through 88C in the margin notes, pages 184 through 5 in our text. And once again, I'll just, rather than read it, jump right into my reconstruction of it. Premise 1. A man is more durable than a cloak, for he may wear out many cloaks in his lifetime. Premise 1. A man is more durable than a cloak, for he may wear out many cloaks in his lifetime. Premise 2. However, the fact that a man is more durable than a cloak does not imply that he must outlast all of his cloaks. The fact that a man is more durable than a cloak does not imply that he must outlast all of his cloaks. That's premise 2. Premise 3. Similarly, we may grant that the soul is more durable than the body, and that it may run through many bodies in the course of its existence. So premise 3, we may grant that the soul is more durable than a body, and that it may run through many bodies in the course of its existence. Premise 4, However, by analogy with a man in his cloaks, this does not imply that the soul must outlast all of its bodies. So premise 4, by analogy with a man in his cloaks, this does not imply that the soul must outlast all of its bodies. Premise 5, we cannot be sure that our body is not our soul's last one, analogous to the man's last cloak. Premise 5, we cannot be sure that our body is not our soul's last one, analogous to the man's last cloak. Conclusion, we cannot be certain that our soul does not perish with the death of our body. So the argument once again, a man is more durable than a cloak, for he may wear out many cloaks in his lifetime. However, the fact that a man is more durable than a cloak does not imply that he must outlast all of his cloaks. Similarly, we may grant that the soul is more durable than the body and that it may run through many bodies in the course of its existence. However, by analogy with a man in his cloaks, this does not imply that the soul must outlast all of its bodies. We cannot be sure that our body is not our soul's last one, analogous to the man's last cloak. Hence the conclusion, we cannot be certain that our soul does not perish with the death of the body. Okay, so there we have the two great objections, the one based upon the idea that the soul is analogous to a harmony, that the soul might be a harmony of the body in much the same way in which the music of a lyre is the harmony of the strings of the lyre, and that just as the harmony that is produced by the lyre cannot survive the breaking of the strings, so too it seems possible that the harmony that the soul may be, as a harmony of the body's various parts, maybe cannot outlast the dissolution, the breaking, so to speak, of these parts, which occurs in the death of the body. And so the divinity of the soul makes no difference. Just like the divinity of the music coming from the lyre makes no difference, they're still perishable in both cases. And then second, the idea that even if we admit the pre-existence of the soul and the reality of reincarnation of the soul cycling through these many bodies, and therefore if we admit that the soul is more durable than the body in that way, it doesn't follow that the soul necessarily has to be utterly imperishable. It may be that it wears out over time, and even though it goes through many bodies in its existence, there is a final body that it goes through, just like a man who goes through many cloaks, many different types of clothing in his life, is not going to outlast all of his clothing. I suppose, unless he became a nudist late in life or something like that. But, the idea is that there's going to be that last cloak. And maybe this body that I have now is my soul's last body in a similar way. So it's not enough for me to just concede recollection and reincarnation as true doctrines and the preexistence of the soul as a true doctrine, because it may very well be that the soul is still as perishable after a long time. Okay, so those are the positions that his interlocutors take. So how is Socrates going to respond to these two challenges? First, Socrates argues that the harmony theory of the soul is incompatible with the doctrine of the preexistence of the soul. Remember, Cebes had conceded the preexistence of the soul and built his argument, assuming that was the case. But Simmias didn't discuss that. That wasn't part of his argument for the harmony view. And so Socrates therefore questions Simmias and says, hey, Simmias, are you still accepting the idea that there's a preexistence of the soul, and that this is part of the doctrine of recollection and so forth? And Simmias says, yeah, I'm still convinced of that. And then Socrates says, well, I've got bad news for you. I'm sorry, but that's incompatible with this new harmony theory that you're proposing. So how does that argument go? It goes as follows. Premise 1. The soul preexists the body. This, as we saw last time, follows from the doctrine of recollection. So we could include that as a pre-argument, but we'll just take this as a taken for granted principle, even though obviously it's It's not one that is self-evident by any means, but in this context, we'll take it for granted. So premise 1, the soul preexists the body. Premise 2, a composite thing cannot preexist its component elements. Premise 2, a composite thing cannot preexist its component elements. Premise 3, a harmony is a composite thing, which is composed of elements of which it is a harmony. Premise 3, a harmony is a composite thing which is composed of elements of which it is a harmony. And so the conclusion, the soul cannot be a harmony of the elements of the body. So that's the argument, simple three-premise argument. The soul preexists the body, but a composite thing cannot preexist its component elements. A harmony is a composite thing, which is composed of elements of which it is a harmony. Hence, the soul cannot be a harmony of the elements of the body. So that's the argument that's based upon accepting the idea of the preexistence of the soul. But also in reply to Simmias, Socrates raises a number of points designed to undermine the analogy between harmony and the soul. So the three initial points he raises, and then a fourth one later on, but the three initial ones are that unlike the soul, it's not capable of being in a different state from the things of which it is composed. A harmony is not capable of being in a different state from the things of which it is composed. And second, it does not direct its components as the soul does, but it's directed by them. And third, different harmonies admit of different degrees of being more or less of a harmony. But souls do not admit of being different degrees of being more or less of a soul. So those are the three disanalogies he notes. Unlike the soul, it's not capable of being in a different state from the things of which it's composed. It doesn't direct its components as the soul does, but is directed by them. And different harmonies admit of degrees of being more or less of a harmony, but souls don't admit of degrees of being more or less of a soul. And we could go into more detail about each one of those, but we'll just leave that in summary form. Furthermore, Socrates suggests that the harmony theory of the soul cannot account for variations in the soul's degree of virtue. The harmony theory of the soul cannot account for variations in the soul's degree of virtue. And this is an additional argument which goes as follows. Premise 1. If the soul is a harmony, then degrees of virtue in the soul must be degrees of harmonization within the soul. So the idea here is that a more virtuous soul would be a more fully harmonized soul, and a more vicious soul would be less harmonized. So premise 1, if the soul is a harmony, then degrees of virtue in the soul must be degrees of harmonization within the soul. Premise 2, however, this presupposes that even a vicious soul involves some degree of harmony. Otherwise, on this theory, it would cease to exist altogether, since on this theory, the soul just is a harmony. So that's premise 2. This presupposes that even a vicious soul involves some degree of harmony. Premise 3, but that is absurd. It's characteristic of a vicious soul to be disharmonious, not harmonious. This would be a kind of commonplace assumption, and certainly something that Plato exploits quite a bit in his philosophy, the idea that a vicious soul is disharmonious. So that's absurd. It's characteristic of a vicious soul to be disharmonious, not harmonious. Premise 4, so either all souls are virtuous and none are vicious, or the soul is not a harmony. Premise 4, so either all souls are virtuous and none are vicious, or the soul is not a harmony. Premise 5, but clearly not all souls are virtuous, some are vicious. Premise 5, but clearly not all souls are virtuous, some are vicious. Conclusion, hence the soul is not a harmony. So here's the argument here once again. If the soul is a harmony, then degrees of virtue in the soul must be degrees of harmonization within the soul. However, this presupposes that even a vicious soul involves some degree of harmony. But that's absurd. It's characteristic of a vicious soul to be disharmonious, not harmonious. So either all souls are virtuous and none are vicious, or the soul is not harmony. But clearly not all souls are virtuous. Some are vicious. Hence, the soul is not a harmony. And then finally, Socrates notes one further disanalogy between the soul and a harmony. The soul rules the body by opposing its appetites and passions. However, if the soul were a harmony, it could never be out of tune, so to speak, with the states of the body. And that seems to be something that's contrary to our experience. When we observe, the soul has to be out of tune with its appetites and passions when it rules them, when it molds them, shapes them, controls them. But there's an initial state of being out of tune with your appetites if you're dieting, for example, or controlling your anger, which is out of tune with the rational part of the soul. And so that finishes Socrates' response to Simmias and the harmony idea of the soul. And we note that the two most elaborated arguments that he gives depend upon premises that might be considered to be controversial. The doctrine of preexistence, the preexistence of the soul, his first main argument depended upon that premise. And then secondly, the idea that virtues must be explicable in terms of degrees of harmonization of the soul. That virtue is a kind of harmony in the soul, and therefore viciousness is a kind of disharmony in the soul. So these are doctrines that Simmias accepts, and that many Greeks might accept, but they are controversial doctrines. And then he has these other, disanalogies as well to kind of buttress these main arguments. But that's his case against Simmias. Then he turns to Cebes' argument. In order to respond to Cebes' objection, he claims that one must thoroughly investigate the causes of generation and destruction. And this launches Socrates on a long digression in which Plato has Socrates survey the various current philosophical opinions about the causes of generation and destruction and propose a theory of the forms as the basis of the best account. The first assumption he makes is that generation is a kind of growth. Socrates explains how he came to reject the materialistic mechanistic theory of growth, which would view growth as a merely additive process of combining units of matter to one another. So this is kind of the simple, crude, materialistic explanation. And he admits that at first this view can seem natural. Page 190. The bottom of the left-hand column there, he says, I thought before that it was obvious to anybody that men grew through eating and drinking, for food adds flesh to flesh and bones to bones, and in the same way appropriate parts were added to all other parts of the body, so that the man grew from an earlier small bulk to a large bulk later, and so a small man became big. That is what I thought then. So, in time, though, Socrates came to regard it as mysterious how two separate things could, merely by being placed close to one another, become one thing. So this is explained on the top of the next column. I will not even allow myself to say that where one is added to one, either the one to which it is added or the one that is added becomes two, or that the one added and the one to which it is added become two because of the addition of the one to the other. I wonder that when each of them is separate from the other, each of them is one. Nor are they then two, but that when they come near to one another, this is the cause of their becoming two. The coming together being placed closer to one another. Nor can I any longer be persuaded that when one thing is divided, this division is the cause of its becoming two. For just now, the cause of becoming two was the opposite. At that time, it was their coming close together, and one was added to another. But now it is because one is taken and separated from another. And at first, this sounds kind of odd, like Socrates is saying he doesn't believe that 1 + 1 = 2. What's going on here? But what he's getting at here is this kind of metaphysical mystery or puzzle. How does merely placing things near to one another, even very near, make them into one thing, into a unity? The additive theory of growth seems to leave the unification of things unexplained. So the mere fact that a piece of metal attaches to a magnet, doesn't make them one thing, right? What makes something one thing, especially when you're considering, in the case of growth and nutrition and the process whereby a living organism changes, there's got to be some kind of principle of unity beyond just the fact that the various parts of the body are very close to one another within the body. What's the principle that unifies these things? So next, Socrates says that he discovered the theory of Anaxagoras, the theory that mind, or nous, is the cause of everything, and hence the cause of generation and growth. Socrates leapt to the conclusion, as Plato dramatizes it here, that since a mind would naturally direct and arrange everything in the way that was best, this should serve as an adequate explanation for generation and growth. In other words, we are introducing the principle of a teleological or purpose-driven cause over and above merely material additive causes. That the mind is directing everything towards the best, and that's what explains generation, is that a mind is directing things towards growth. But again, he's just disappointed because, as we saw in our examination of Anaxagoras in the earlier video, Anaxagoras, even though he has this principle of nous or mind, also favors materialistic explanations, mechanical explanations, or explanations in terms of material substances of various kinds. And this was what was the cause of Socrates, or more likely Plato's, disappointment. He says, this is beginning in the middle of the left-hand column on page 191. This wonderful hope, the wonderful hope he had that Anaxagoras was going to have the key in his principle of mind to explaining growth. This wonderful hope was dashed as I went on reading and saw that the man made no use of mind, nor gave it any responsibility for the management of things, but mentioned as causes air and ether and water and many other strange things. That seemed to me much like saying that Socrates' actions are all due to his mind, and then in trying to tell the causes of everything I do, to say that the reason I am sitting here is because my body consists of bones and sinews, because the bones are hard and are separated by joints, that the sinews are such as to contract and relax, that they surround the bones along with flesh and skin which holds them together. Then as the bones are hanging in their sockets, the relaxation and contraction of the sinews enabled me to bend my limbs, and that is the cause of my sitting here with my limbs bent. So Socrates is clearly convinced of the primacy of teleological or purpose-driven causes over merely material ones, materialistic causes. He even makes a bit of a mockery of Anaxagoras' materialistic tendencies. On the top of the next column, for by the dog, I think these sinews and bones could long ago have been in Megara or among the Boeotians, taken there by my belief as to the best course, if I had not thought it more right and honorable to endure whatever penalty the city ordered rather than escape and run away. To call those things causes is too absurd. To call those things causes is too absurd. If someone said that without bones and sinews and all such things, I should not be able to do what I decided, he would be right. But surely to say that they are the cause of what I do, and not that I have chosen the best course, even though I act with my mind, is to speak very lazily and carelessly. So it's true that bones, sinews, matter generally is a necessary condition for certain things to be brought into effect. That is, without matter, one would not be able to realize one's purpose, but that doesn't make matter the real cause for Socrates. It's a condition, but it's not a cause. The cause is going to be teleological. It's going to be a purpose that's to be fulfilled. And that is attributable to a mind. And so Anaxagoras was on the right track when he proposed mind or nous as the cause of growth and other things. But he abandoned his insight and followed the path of people like Thales and so on, and tried to explain things in terms of these material causes, which is a task that material things just can't do. They can't serve as causes. They are indeed conditions, and you can talk about how they operate, as Socrates does here, but they don't give you the cause. So it was the inadequacy of these materialistic or quasi-materialistic theories that led Socrates to the theory of the forms, according to this account in Plato, which we, as we said before, we take with a grain of salt as being true of Socrates. But this is the account that Plato is giving here of Socrates' curriculum vitae, so to speak. So now the focus is on the forms here as the causes of things. We've talked about the forms, sketched the doctrine of the forms out before. But here the focus is on understanding the forms as causal principles. Quote, if there is anything besides the beautiful itself, it is beautiful for no other reason than that it shares in the beautiful, unquote. That's the basic schema for the causal explanation that appeals to the forms. So in place of the beautiful here, you could put any form, but that gives you the idea of the kind of causal explanation that Socrates finally arrives at. If there's anything besides the beautiful itself, it is beautiful for no other reason than that it shares in the beautiful. That's page 192 on the left-hand column. So the cause of the beauty of beautiful things is nothing besides the form of beauty itself. Or as Socrates says on the same page, quote, it is through beauty that beautiful things are made beautiful, unquote. It is through beauty, with a capital B, that beautiful things are made beautiful. The same principle, of course, would be applied to all other particular things. The cause of their being X would be their sharing in the form of X. That's the causal principle. The cause of something's being, fill in the blank, is their sharing in the form of that thing, that predicate. So the hypothesis that Socrates gets Cebes to accept is that the forms exist, and each particular thing gets its name by having a share in the form. The forms exist, and each particular thing gets its name by having a share in the form. So this leads to our first discussion question. Does the theory of the forms provide a better philosophical account of generation and growth than the materialist account? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each type of account? So that's the first discussion question. Does the theory of the forms provide a better philosophical account of generation and growth than the materialist account? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each type of account? And I'm going to say more now to fill this in a little bit, so you don't necessarily have to answer this now. I'm going to introduce the second discussion question after we're done showing how this pertains to the answer to C.B.'s objection to Socrates' doctrine of the imperishability of the soul. And so we'll ask a second discussion question, which of course is going to have to be about the imperishability of the soul, which we haven't raised yet so far in these videos on the Phaedo. So I'm introducing this first one here, just to keep them somewhat separate from each other in our exposition here. But keep in mind that there is more than I've said so far about this causal theory that employs the forms. And we'll see this if we start to think about sort of obvious objections that one might raise to this theory. We'll see how he needs to fill this in and what he does along those lines. Now, one obvious problem with this account is in dealing with predicates that are comparative or relational. So, for example, Simmias is taller than Socrates, but shorter than Phaedo. Hence, it would seem that he must partake both of the form of the tall and the form of the short. But tallness itself is never short, and shortness itself is never tall. So how can they coexist together in the same being, Simmias, at the same time? And Socrates concludes that they cannot. So he says on the top of the right-hand column of page 193, now it seems to me that not only tallness itself is never willing to be tall and short at the same time, but also that tallness in us will never admit the short or be overcome. But one of two things happens. Either it flees and retreats whenever its opposite, the short, approaches, or it is destroyed by its approach. It is not willing to endure and admit shortness and be other than it was, whereas I admit and endure shortness and still remain the same person I am, this short man. But tallness, being tall, cannot venture to be small. In the same way, the short in us is unwilling to become or to be tall ever, nor does any other of the opposites become or be its opposite while still being what it was. Either it goes away or is destroyed when that happens. So this is making the rather straightforward and apparently plausible, obvious point that opposite forms cannot coexist together in the same being. And we might add here, cannot coexist together in the same part at the same time and so forth. But they cannot coexist together in the same being. So how can this be reconciled with the doctrine propounded back in the first half of the Phaedo that opposites come from opposites? And this is raised by an objection by someone, some anonymous heckler in the peanut gallery in Phaedo's account of how this conversation transpired. So, hey Socrates, how can you reconcile this point that opposites can't coexist with the earlier point you made in the first half of the conversation in the preceding video that opposites come from opposites? And here Socrates draws a distinction. And I've written the two distinct points. You can see how these could be easily confused, but if you study them carefully, you'll see that these are separate points. So the distinction is that it's one thing to say that a thing comes from the opposite thing. It's quite another thing to say that the opposite itself could never become the opposite to itself. Okay, so these are two separate principles. A thing comes from the opposite thing, and the opposite itself never becomes opposite to itself. So tallness never becomes short. Tallness itself, that is, never becomes shortness. The hot itself never becomes cold. That would be pretty straightforwardly a manifest contradiction. But a thing can come from the opposite thing. So what Plato seems to be saying here is that this principle concerns things, whereas this one concerns forms. The forms in themselves, as well as the forms as they exist in things, or as things share in them. So things come from opposite things, but this doesn't mean that opposite forms can ever coexist at the same time in one single thing. What this suggests is a picture of change in which change is accounted for in a thing by appealing to its losing or relinquishing one form and subsequently gaining or acquiring the opposite form. So, for example, the form of hot is lost and cold is gained when something hot is cooled, and so forth. But hot never becomes cold. The hot itself, the hotness itself never becomes cold. Even though the thing, which at one time partook of the form of hot and later time partakes of the form of cold, actually does undergo a change. Plato argues that not only do forms never admit their opposite in the same being at the same time, but they also do not admit any other form that is opposite to its character, as Plato says. And this is a bit of a subtle point that one needs to go slow, perhaps, to grasp for the first time. But the example he gives is that the numbers 3 and 5 never admit the form of the even, and 2 and 4 never admit the form of the odd. That's on page 194. And he summarizes the principle at work here, which is the crucial principle, even though it's a complex one. So it's laid out right here at the bottom of your text. I won't write it down because you can just look at the text. But you'll want to study and digest this principle because it plays a crucial role in the response to CB's objection that's coming right up. So he says, this is 4 lines down from the bottom of the right-hand column on page 194. Not only does the opposite not admit its opposite, but that which brings along some opposite into that which it occupies, that which brings this along will not admit the opposite to that which it brings along. And the best way maybe to explain this principle is to see how he applies it with examples. And initially, what he says is that this principle, that namely that that which brings along with it some form into that which it occupies will not admit the opposite to that form which it brings along, allows for a somewhat more sophisticated explanation for why a thing has the properties it has. A more sophisticated explanation that is then just the straight up appeal to the form. You know, why is this thing hot? Well, because it partakes of the form of the hot. Right? This is what Socrates made a big to-do about when he first proposed it by saying that I'm just going to give this simple explanation because I don't understand what these sophisticated natural scientists are saying. And so I'm just going to say this thing's hot because it partakes of the form of the hot. But now, at this point, actually, he introduces a somewhat more sophisticated explanation. It allows him to say that a certain form is predicated of a thing because of the presence in it of something else that excludes its opposite. So the examples are given here in this, I guess the first complete long paragraph on page 195 in the left-hand column. If you should ask me what coming into a body makes it hot, my reply would not be that safe and ignorant one, that it is heat. That was the first one. You know, what makes this body hot? Well, it's got heat in it. That's what he's here calling the safe and ignorant reply. But that our present argument provides a more sophisticated answer, namely fire. And if you ask me what on coming into a body makes it sick, I will not say sickness, but fever. Nor if asked the presence of what in a number makes it odd, I will not say oddness, but oneness, and so with other things. So, in other words, since the fire, according to the principle just articulated, the one that appears at the bottom of page 194 on the right-hand column to the top of 195, according to this principle, fire excludes its opposite, cold, and because of that principle, we can explain the presence of heat in a thing by reference to the fire in it, which never admits cold. And similarly with sickness and fever. Since fire excludes its opposite, cold, and because of the principle Socrates just articulated, we can explain the presence of heat in a thing by reference to the fire in it, which never admits cold. So why is it hot? Well, it's got fire in it, and fire never admits cold, and so it's hot. And with sickness and fever, you give similar explanations. That's the point. Okay, so this form of explanation allows Socrates to finally reply to Cebes' objection that the soul possibly wears out after a certain number of reincarnations. So this is the argument. Premise 1. A soul is that which, being present in a body, makes it living. Premise 1. A soul is that which, being present in a body, makes it living. This, of course, is the common assumption, almost the definition of a soul for the Greek. That a soul is that which, in its presence in the body, makes it living. Premise 2. Thus, the soul brings along with it the form of life into the body that it occupies. Premise 2. Thus, the soul brings along with it the form of life into the body that it occupies. Premise 3. The opposite form to the form of life is the form of death. Premise 3. The opposite form to the form of life is the form of death. Premise 4. That which brings along with it some form into that which it occupies will not admit the opposite to that form which it brings along. This is the principle that appears, again, on the bottom right-hand column of 194 to the top of the left-hand column of 195. So premise 4, that which brings along with it some form into that which it occupies will not admit the opposite to that form which it brings along. As fire, which brings heat into the body, doesn't admit cold, for example. So that's premise 4. Once again, that which brings along with it some form into that which it occupies will not admit the opposite to that form which it brings along. Premise 5. Hence, the soul will not admit the form of death. Premise 5. Hence, the soul will not admit the form of death. Premise 6. But the soul can die only if it can admit the form of death. Premise 6. But the soul can die only if it can admit the form of death. Conclusion. Therefore, the soul cannot die. Therefore, the soul cannot die, which of course is what was to be proved. So this is the argument once again. A soul is that which, being present in a body, makes it living. Thus, the soul brings along with it the form of life into the body that it occupies. The opposite form to the form of life is the form of death. That which brings along with it some form into that which it occupies will not admit the opposite to that form which it brings along. Hence, the soul will not admit the form of death. But the soul can die only if it can admit the form of death. Therefore, the soul cannot die. So this is the argument that responds to Cebes. And notice here, this is not an argument that depends upon analogy in the way the initial argument did. The initial argument in the discussion of this video, the final argument of the previous video, which is concluding the first half of the Phaedo. This argument is based upon the theory of the forms and is not based merely on an analogy. Of course, to accept this argument, you have to find the theory of the forms plausible and the kind of natural explanations it provides to be indispensable, or at least the best candidate for explaining natural phenomena. So this leads to a second discussion question. Does Socrates succeed in demonstrating through philosophical argument that the soul is imperishable? With what degree of certainty does he establish this conclusion? Are his responses to Simmias and Cebes adequate? Justify your answers. So this is a discussion question that really is about the main argument of the Phaedo as a whole, which is aiming at proving the immortality of the soul, the imperishability of the soul. So feel free to draw upon any aspect of Socrates' arguments here. Does Socrates succeed in demonstrating through philosophical argument that the soul is imperishable? With what degree of certainty does he establish this conclusion? Are his responses to Simmias and Cebes adequate? Justify your answers. So that completes the philosophical content of the Phaedo. The remaining portion of the text is taken up, with writing that serves Plato's religio-mythological, as we might call it, his religio-mythological, that is his religious and mythological, and also his biographical purposes, to give an account of Socrates' final moments. First, there's an elaborately developed imaginative vision of the cosmos and the relation of the realm of the living to the realms of the dead within the cosmos, and a religious vision of final judgment. And then second, there's a moving account of the last moments of Socrates' life and his conduct during those last minutes and his attitude when facing death. You can read these for yourselves. They don't require much commentary from me. I will just invite you to consider Plato's religious vision and the obviously profound influence that it has had on the Christian and perhaps the Muslim religion, but certainly had a profound influence on the Christian religion. It's also worth noting Socrates' final words in the last column there, page 201. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offering to him and do not forget. So what's the meaning, what's the significance of this owing a cock to Asclepius? And the footnote helps us out here. Asclepius is the god of healing. A cock was sacrificed to him by the sick people who slept in his temple, hoping for a cure. So the implication of these words is that Socrates viewed life itself as an affliction, something to be cured. Life was an illness. Life was a kind of disease that needed a cure. And death was really the cure. Death was a welcome recovery from that long illness called life. A most peculiar and unusual attitude towards life from a most peculiar and unusual man named Socrates.